What the hell? Stan's doing a game review? Well, no. This isn't a review. It's a recommendation. I've been a fan of Darksiders since the first game, and ever since Darksiders 3 released a few weeks ago, I've been playing the living daylights out of it. It's the only game I've ever pre-ordered, and I do not regret doing so. The game has gotten a pretty rough reception by general reviewers and fans alike, a reception that I don't think matches the experience of the game, so I'd like to address some of that criticism and express why I think that Darksiders 3 is not only a good game, but a worthy addition to the franchise. A little bit of background. Darksiders takes place during the Armageddon, where you play as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. In this game's universe, they are War, Death, Fury, and Strife. Each game features one of those characters thrown into a game world that is an homage to other game franchise mechanics. In the first game, you play as War, and the mechanics and level design are similar to God of War and Zelda. In the second game, you play as Death, and the mechanics and level design are similar to a vast dungeon crawler like Diablo. Shortly after Darksiders 2 was released, THQ went out of business. And that, thought we fans of the series, was the end of Darksiders forever. But as divine providence would have it, Gunfire Games picked up the series and set about making the third installment. And here it is. This time the mechanics and level design are similar to Dark Souls and Metroid. You play as Fury, and your mission is to hunt down and recapture the souls of the 7 deadly sins, who are all personified as boss fights. The combat, while still hack and slash, is more tactical and relies on timing your dodges, counterattacking, and knowing enemy attack patterns. And the levels are an interconnected series of tunnels and open areas that all loop back on each other. All of this is much smaller in scale to the last game, and a lot of the looting and key collecting aspects have been jettisoned and replaced by the interconnectivity of secret passages and finding item drops similar to Dark Souls. And here I think is where the first batch of criticisms were coming from. Dark Souls has been cloned a lot over the years, and it seems that once a new mechanic or design becomes popular, it tends to get cynically copied and shoveled out a la Battle Royale modes. This may have given the appearance that Darksiders 3 was taking the lazy approach by just cloning a popular game design, which would be an appropriate reaction if not for the fact that borrowing game designs and mechanics is what Darksiders does. It's a tradition and part of the charm of the franchise. You take a horseman, put him or her in a game world that is an homage to other games, but steep it in its own lore, art design, and story. This game is no different. The only thing I've heard to back up the perception that this game is more shameless in its borrowing than any other Darksiders game came from Jim Sterling, whose name and impressions video I will refer to a lot, as he is the most high-profile game reviewer who was a fan of the series that I know of. He pointed out that Darksiders 3 has a character called the Lord of Hollows, which is a name and theme of a character in one of the Dark Souls games. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if a Lord of Hollows or Hollows in general come from other stories. I know there's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, but yeah, that's borrowing from the lore of another game in addition to the mechanics and design. But so what? The Lord of Hollows is interesting and quite distinct from the character whose name he's based on. I think that observation was meant to show that Darksiders 3 was just a rip-off of Dark Souls, but no, this game does not feel like a Dark Souls game. It feels unequivocally like a Darksiders game. If you had told me 2 years ago that they were making a Darksiders 3 and that this time it was borrowing from the Dark Souls mechanics, this is exactly what I would have expected. In his Jimpressions video, Sterling said something to the effect that the people who made this game didn't understand what makes Dark Souls good, and maybe so, maybe they didn't. But they clearly understood what made Darksiders good, and that is to take a straightforward hack-and-slash adventure game that nods to other franchises but that is steeped in its own identity, that is the Darksiders universe. This game did that. It did it as well as the other two, hands down. And that really is the impression that some of these reviews may have given that I really want to dispel. None of this feels cynical or slapped together. None of this feels like the developers sat down and went, just make it Dark Souls and call it a day. It feels like a Darksiders game made by people who love the franchise and who get what Darksiders is supposed to be. The other major criticism that this game is getting is how it runs. And yes, the game stops and loads in weird places all over the place. I've had that experience. I've had experiences where the environment failed to load for a bit. These issues exist, and it's perfectly acceptable to point them out and criticize the game for it. But one thing that cannot be overstated is how much I didn't care while I was playing it, and that seems to be pretty universal too. A lot of the reviews I've seen say something to the effect of, none of this breaks the game's experience, and I think that's very telling. This was made by a small studio with a small budget, and despite the full $60 price tag, I think they deserve some leeway. I know this is a really unpopular thing to say, and I don't think that we should praise studios for aiming low and hitting that mark, but it's okay for a game to have technical issues, even performance issues, especially when the reasons for those issues are so well known and so understandable. We knew that this was a small upstart studio making a game on a small budget and limited resources. And yes, they charged $60, and so that gives everybody carte blanche to be as merciless as possible when pointing out the flaws in a game. But honestly, if the fact that abrupt loading happens is a breaking point for you, that's your prerogative, but it wasn't for me, and it doesn't sound like it was for many other people, even people who didn't like the game much. Other criticisms vary. Some people thought that the combat was downright broken, others thought it was so functional that it was too easy. Me, I find it challenging but satisfying. Some people thought that the environments left a lot to be desired. Me, I think they ranged from good to downright gorgeous. Some people thought that the boss fights were unimaginative and straightforward. I found a lot of them to be very dynamic and unique, particularly when you have to fight Lust. Sterling in particular thought that this game was a leap back from the second game because of how much smaller and stripped down the elements were. But here again, we knew that a small studio was doing this. If you're going to do Darksiders on a budget and you have to make it a smaller experience, this design is exactly the way to go. They made good use of what they had. None of this is meant to be a refutation of other reviews. On the contrary, I am genuinely sorry to anyone who did not have a good time playing this game, mostly because of how much of a blast I've had playing it for the last few weeks. Darksiders 3 is not the best video game in the world. It isn't trying to be the best video game in the world. Battlefront 2 was trying to be the best video game in the world. Destiny was trying to be the best video game in the world. Darksiders 3 is the kind of games that studios should be making. A mid-tier action game that is just a video game, not a vehicle for loot boxes or microtransactions or DLC. It gives you fun things to do and lets you go do them. And that's the bottom line. It's fun and it's cool. It builds on the lore of Darksiders, it gives us one of the more interesting horsemen, Fury's different abilities are awesome, the exploration is great, leveling feels good, it's just a great experience. I just love this game, and I haven't just loved a game in a long time. If you're new to the series, I strongly recommend picking up the Darksiders War Mastered Edition, Darksiders 2 Deathfinitive Edition, and this game. And if you're a veteran of the series, Darksiders 3 gets my highest recommendation.